All right, so our next speaker is Jono. He's the person who literally wrote the book on open source communities, The Art of Community, as well as a former community manager for GitHub, XPRIZE, Open Advantage, and Canonical. Everyone, please welcome Jono.
Thank you. All right, how's everyone doing? Is that all you've got? Come on, how's everyone doing? All right? All right. That's more like it. All right. So first of all, I want to say a big thank you to Molly for inviting me to come and speak. I spent some time with Molly in Australia a little while back, and we had a great time. So it's great to be speaking in front of everyone. A little bit of backstory. Recently set up a consultant practice to help companies and organizations build communities internally or externally. And as was just mentioned, I used to spend some time helping to lead community at GitHub, Ubuntu, and XPRIZE. I'm really passionate about how we build communities. I believe that communities are at the center of how we as human beings innovate and build interesting things. And I think most communities today, frankly, are inefficient. And then when we understand the principles of how people work well together, we can innovate faster, we can create better things. And I think edX is a great example of that. So I want to, first of all, tell a little story about a guy called Frank, who the name has been changed to protect the innocent. Frank basically joined an open source project a little while back. He was using the product for a while. He was excited about it and thought, I'd like to scratch my own itch and do something that will be interesting for the project. So he joined up, went to the website, clicked on the community page, and thought, this is the beginning of my adventure. And he was asked to join a mailing list and go and get the code from GitHub. So he went, got the code from GitHub, and he tried to figure it out, found an issue of something to work on, struggled his way through it, and had to contribute this new thing, his new idea, to this community out in the open. And it was terrifying for him. The way he described it to me was like going to a nudist colony for the first time. And he was very self-conscious about how he was looking, whether he was doing the right things. You don't want to inadvertently break the rules that weren't written down. The whole thing was a disaster for him. It was terrifying, it was uncertain, and overall not a lot of fun. And the whole point of building communities is that we build great environments for people to be successful in. And this has been the core of the work that I've tried to focus on throughout my career, is how do we distill the very best ways in which we work together to build great communities. And to me, this is not about having all of the answers, because I certainly don't have all the answers. It's about knowing some of the answers and packaging them up in a way that can be helpful to other people. And I think one inspiration here, bizarrely, is McDonald's. How many here have eaten at McDonald's recently?
No one's gonna.
The level of sheepishness was ridiculous. And pride. McDonald's, powering edX. Okay. So think about it, though. The thing that's cool about McDonald's, the innovation that Ray Kroc had with McDonald's was, those of you who've been to McDonald's will have probably noticed that the people who work at McDonald's are not necessarily the sharpest tools in the tool shed, right? And if you think about just making fries, you take potatoes and you put them into boiling hot fat for a certain period of time, and then you take it out of that fat and you put some salt in it, and you put it into packaging and you deliver it. And you're supposed to do the whole thing where you have the same level of quality and you're not going to get people sick. So you've basically got people who aren't particularly skilled cooks following complicated processes and delivering predictable results. And to me, that's the whole point of how we build great communities. And I think there are lots of really great methodologies in which we can do this. And over the years, one of the things I've thought about is that we're wanting to build kind of like a suit for people that they can use that optimizes them for the very best community experience. As a fan of Iron Man, this got me thinking, like, what would an exoskeleton look like? Like, how do we infuse this suit with the very best capabilities to help someone to do well? And in the interest of inclusion and diversity, of course, this doesn't just apply to men, okay? We should have Iron Woman suits as well. And it's weird when you type in Iron Man and other terms like women or, you know, I found all of this on the internet as well. There's some weird people on the internet, it turns out. So as I'm talking through this stuff, one thing I want us to keep in mind is that every community is different. You know, when I've worked with companies, a lot of companies, when I've worked with them, say, like, tell us the secrets, how do we do this? And there's no playbook, there's no single way in which you build a community for an organization or for a project. You know, you could take the principles of a very successful community like OpenStack or Linux and bring it word for word into another place, and it just won't work. You've got to adapt it because this is about building culture. So what I'm talking about here is really about mapping out a blueprint. I'm not going to be delving too specific into the execution principles, because that differs depending on the organization, the project that you're working with. So the idea here is sketching out the map of how we build great communities to get you thinking about some things that you can explore in your own world as well. So the question is, like, what's the point of this exoskeleton? Like, why are we doing this? Why are we building this? And those of you who've been working around technology for a while will be familiar with this thing. It's called the technology adoption curve. And the basic principle is, you know, as technology is adopted, the people at the beginning are the innovators. These are like people like you in the room, like people who are right at the cutting edge of building interesting technology and doing interesting things. And then gradually, those people will inspire the early adopters. And this is when you start seeing, you know, tech websites and conferences starting to pick up on it. And then you get the hump up here is the early majority and the late majority. This is when most people start using it. This is the people who go to the stores, go to Best Buy, and they buy it. The late majority is people who are a little bit slow to the, you know, to the race, and the laggards are my parents. This is basically how technology tends to be adopted, and I think you can take a similar approach and principle in community productivity, in the fact that this is time. So at the beginning, you join a community, and you're not particularly productive. You're doing some interesting things, but the more you spend time there, and the more you soak up the environment, the more productive you are. What's interesting with a lot of communities, and particularly in open source, is when people have been around a community for a long time, their productivity often goes down because they start developing shades of entitlement. And we want to protect against that. We don't just want to optimize people to get in quickly, but we also want to ensure that we reduce entitlement so people are productive, but they're not expecting the world to be built in their shadow. Now, if you look at the technology adoption curve, a core principle of this is called the chasm, which is basically here. And I think the same thing applies in the community productivity model, is that once you get going and you get to a certain point, you've got this little gap that's really difficult to get over. And on the technology adoption curve, before this gap is basically Silicon Valley. And after that gap is basically the brands and products that everybody's familiar with. And getting over that gap is really complicated. And I think it's the same thing with how we build great communities. It's easy to go out there and tell people about how great your project is on social media and to write blog posts and do YouTube videos. But once you get them and once they're interested, that gap can be the thing that stops people participating in your project. And to me, that's the point of this exoskeleton, is to equip people with the knowledge and the skills to get them through that so they can start being productive. Now, in the interest of being a lame presenter, I've got to show Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And everybody thinks Wi-Fi should be at the bottom. You know, we could apply the same kind of principles to how, like, what's important in how communities work. But I think it looks more like this, is that typically what happens is you've got a bunch of people, the shadowy cabal, who primarily discover what you're doing through your product or the focus of your community. So that could be they start using edX, they become fans of the Creative Commons, whatever it might be. And then what happens is they come into this kind of cycle. And the first thing they need to figure out is, how do I actually do something? Like, what's the workflow? In software, that's, you know, how do I get the code? How do I work in the code? What does it look like? How do I understand which issues to focus on? How does code review work? All those kinds of pieces. But then what they need to do is they need to see a picture of their relevance in that world. You know, some of you may be familiar with this notion called imposter syndrome, which is when people join a company or a community or something like that, and they feel like, you know, they're doing okay, that they're going to be found out at some point. I don't think the world realizes how significant imposter syndrome is in society. It affects so many people. It affected me at the beginning of my career a lot, for example. So I think helping people to see their relevance and value in that community is very important. Then the next piece is relationships. Just like a company, if you don't build relationships, you don't succeed. You know, I just read a story about some guy who worked for a Silicon Valley company who basically automated his entire work and then just sat playing World of Warcraft for 6 years. and didn't build any relationships or anything like that, and eventually got found out. However, that is an illustration of how not building relationships lets you get away with nothing for 6 years. So I might be wrong about this. But yeah, see, we want to help people build relationships, because when you build those relationships and you feel that sense of relevance, it means that you grow. Not just in terms of your intrinsic capabilities, such as your skills, but you grow in that sense of being part of something. And the thing that I've been rambling on about for years is the most important thing that we can build in any community is a sense of belonging. You know, when you feel like you belong somewhere, whether it's in a community, whether it's in your family, whether it's in your coffee shop, it feels good, and it means that you want to be there and you want to participate. Because we often forget that we're animals, and when you take away the screens and the computers and everything else, we have a very simple, basic set of drivers, and feeling that sense of belonging is important. So I think to build that at Exoskeleton, we can break it into 3 areas. We want to make sure that we help people to be effective as people. We want to help them to deliver great best practice in how they engage and build and participate. And then finally, in how they participate, we want to make it easy for people to come in and be successful in the way that they contribute to the community in different ways. So I'm going to walk through each of these, and we'll start with people. Now, we're talking a lot about this fictional exoskeleton, but I think before we can really understand how to build the tactical pieces, we need to understand the principles of what make people people. One of the big mistakes I think a lot of organizations make and a lot of communities make is they go racing for the tactical pieces, like mailing lists and communication channels and Slack and GitHub and all these different pieces. And they forget that all of those bits are tools that serve psychology. And I think looking at that psychology is important. So we need to get underneath the suit. We need to get naked. And this poses a problem as a presenter, because you don't want to put a naked slide up because you're going to get into trouble, because it's not going to be good for anybody. So this is the best I've got. I think that when we look at the nakedness of the human condition, there are basically 2 types of communities, and we need to set expectations in both of those. So there's read communities. These are the communities where people get together to consume something. So for example, people who are into Game of Thrones, or they're into Beyonce, or whatever it might be. A lot of these people get together at events or on forums and things like that because they enjoy spending time with each other. Fundamentally, they're not really building anything together. They're just enjoying being around people with like minds who understand them, who accept them, and that's incredibly rewarding. Right communities are the kind of communities where people get together to build something. edX is a good example of that. Open source Wikipedia is an example of that. The expectations with those 2 groups is very different. So as an example, when I was at Canonical and we were building the Ubuntu community, we started out with the right community, which was people who were contributing to the platform itself. And they were emotionally invested in that platform, and they expected a high level of transparency and openness. But then we built out a separate community of people who would build apps for Ubuntu. And all they cared about was getting the SDK, making sure that it worked and that there was great documentation. They didn't feel like they had to have a hand in how that SDK was created. They were just consuming it. So it's good to define which community we're in, but then I think it's also good for us to define the different roles that we have. And I think that with most communities, you've got 3 approximate roles. New people who are brand new, regulars who are kind of spending a reasonable amount of time there, and then the core people, people right at the center of this, the people who are leading your community in different ways. Now, I think what's very important here is that we define user personas. And this sounds like one of those things that you read about in books that people never do. And that's true. But for us to deconstruct those 3 different types of persona is very important in understanding not only how we build workflow that works well for them, but also how we target them and help them to consume our messaging to bring them into the community. So I think that there's basically 6 things that we should consider in each persona. The first thing is the capabilities. What can they do? What are their skills? What are their capabilities? The second piece is experience. How much experience have they got? Are they professional? Are they students? What does that look like? The third thing is, what are their motivations? What do they care about? What's interesting to them? Then, what are their fears? What worries them? And in many cases, these fears are never shared. They're just intrinsic in people. Then we need to figure out what are their rewards. You know, for example, the rewards of an enterprise software developer who works in a bank is very different to a software developer who works at a small startup. So what are those different types of rewards? And then how do they consume? What websites, what journals, what resources do they use to consume information? So to provide an example, imagine we're looking at somebody who's brand new to a community, and they're working on a web project. So the capabilities, they're probably going to be able to program in something like Python. They may know HTML and CSS. They probably know a bit of JavaScript. They're probably familiar with test-driven development, almost certainly have a mustache or wear their parents' clothes. I'm not bitter. So in terms of their experience, if they're new, they may have some experience at college. They may have participated in a few open source projects. They may have a bit of professional experience, but probably not a vast amount of technical experience. For their motivations, they probably really care about skills development. A lot of people who are new to communities really care about the, by definition, motivated people. Most people don't join open source communities if they just want to go home and watch TV in the evenings. These are self-motivated people, so they care about the skills development. They probably care about respect among their peers, particularly if they're new. Like when you're new to a project, you have no context, no relationships. So respect and gaining respect is very important. They probably want to build experience and reputation for future employment. And some people may also have a financial incentive, particularly for a student. You don't have any money. If you can make a little bit of money on the side to buy more ramen noodles, then that's a good thing. And then the fears are probably going to be things like social exclusion, just looking stupid. It sounds like a silly thing because there are no stupid questions. But people really care about that and maybe are worried that you'll take on something that's too complicated and then you'll look stupid and then you'll be excluded from the pack. I think in terms of rewards, there are always intrinsic rewards and extrinsic. So the intrinsic rewards, the things that matter to you as a human being, things such as respect, reputation, relationships. But extrinsic rewards are things like financial benefits and material benefits, such as t-shirts, caps, going to conferences, and things like that. And it's easy for us to say, I don't care about the extrinsic rewards. Anyone who says that is a liar. Everybody cares about extrinsic rewards to a certain degree. And then the final one is how they consume. They're probably going to be, this new web developer probably consumes long-form tutorials. They probably read Hacker News. They probably ask questions on Stack Exchange. They watch a bunch of YouTube videos. There's social media that they consume. And you can wrap all of this in demographic information and research as well. So if you're targeting, for example, I was working with a Chinese company who was building the community, and the way in which the Chinese community works is very different to the way in which people work in the West. For example, the Chinese community don't use Slack, they use WeChat, as a tiny example. So making those user personas, I think, is important for our those three different types, new, regular, and core. But then I think it's really important for us to look at the heart of what makes us human beings. And I have to be careful here because I'm a bit of a nerd in an area called behavioral economics. And some of you may be familiar with this. The basic principle is that human beings are fundamentally irrational. And I think most of us know that. But we're irrational in very predictable ways. So the classic example here is there was a goal to reduce childhood obesity. And a principal of a school didn't have a lot of money and a lot of capabilities to help with this, but she basically reordered the lunch line. So when the kids showed up, all the healthy stuff was at the front. And kids, by definition, would fill their plates up. And then when they got to the unhealthy stuff, the idea of putting that stuff back is socially weird. So everybody was, even though the kids want the cheeseburger, they don't want the kale. No one wants kale. They're not going to do that. So we're predictable in the way that we're irrational. And behavioral economics, it provides an important blueprint for how human beings tend to think. So the classic example here that I like to talk about is something called the SCARF model, which was created by a guy called Dr. David Rock. And these are basically five principles that are inherent in most human beings that we care about. I won't spend too much time on this because we don't have a lot of time. But so first of all, status. We all care about status. So in communities, it's good for us to define status types like new, regular, and core and help people to flow between those different status types. We care about certainty. Uncertainty causes stress. It causes burnout, causes problems. Think about when you have a bad relationship with your boss. So we want to reduce the level of uncertainty in communities. Autonomy. People really care about choice. Even if all of the choices line up to the same result. Like when you go and buy a car, they'll ask you what wheels you want, what color it should be, what extras you want. You're still giving Ford all of your money. But the fact that you get to make choices is fulfilling for people. People care about relatedness as well. This is different groups and how they fit together. So a lot of open source communities will have a development team and a docs team and a translations team. This is helpful for scope. And then finally, what was really interesting to me
is that his research determined that people not only care about being treated fairly, but they don't like people to be treated unfairly as well. So we want to build a community that's fundamentally fair. Now, I think a really interesting methodology in how we build great things is to take a pattern and then to invert it, and that will tell you the things that you shouldn't do. So for example, imagine you work for a company, you want to build a cell phone, and you'll talk about like a nice screen, and the power and the capabilities and the software and all this kind of stuff. Instead, invert the question and say, what would be the worst possible cell phone? So for example, for me, the worst possible cell phone is that I can only receive calls from my best friend, because he's really annoying. Or that it's really laggy. And then, or that the buttons are too small for my little stubby sausage fingers, Because what that does is that gives you the things that you should avoid, and then you build functionality into your product that avoids those things. So I think with these principles, the opposite of status are clicks. We don't like clicks, so we should figure out a way of reducing silos. The opposite of certainty is stress, so we should find opportunities to reduce stress and uncertainty in our communities. The opposite of choice are limits. So we should say to ourselves, when we build our communities, never ever have one way of doing things, because it's unfulfilling for people. The opposite of relatedness is chaos. Nobody particularly likes chaos. So having quality structure in how we build our communities is good. And the opposite of fairness is bias. And this has been a heavy topic of conversation, particularly in open source, is reducing bias, whether it comes to gender or sexuality or other different things. We should be explicit in reducing bias. So that covers just a couple of examples of how we think about the people, like really understanding that human blueprint and how we can manage that. For the practice, how we build systems that we engage with, the workflow, I'd like to share one quote. Presenters put quotes into slides to look clever. And that's not my goal here, but this really is a great quote from Albert Einstein. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. Some people think that complexity and process is a sign of a mature, complicated project, and that's nonsense. We should make things really easy. I remember I kicked off an open source project years ago to create a very simple multi-track editor for Linux. And some guy posted in a comment, said, this is ridiculous, this is abhorrent to the spirit of open source and choice. If you had your way, you would have an interface with one button that you press, and then it solves all of your problems, wouldn't you? I was like, yes! People talk about how the nipple is the most perfect human interface. It is. It's intrinsic to how kids work. That would be the perfect interface. So let's not think that simple means stupid. It means elegant. The challenge with most communities is that you've got to figure out all these things: code hosting, communication, governance, translations, bug management. This is a lot to squeeze into someone's head. And we need to manage how people do those things effectively. So I think the first thing you want to do is think about the flow of information in your workflow. So this is just an example, but typically people will have ideas. How do we help the best ideas jump to the surface? How do we communicate effectively in terms of our mediums, but also the conduct on those mediums? How do we plan well? Some communities are very ad hoc. Some have structured planning and use agile and burn down and whatever else. How do we develop software? How do we build great software? How do we have great principles in our software development? How do we do quality, continuous integration, and various other bits and pieces? How do we ship effectively? Not just how do we stick binaries on the internet, but how do we support them? How do we engage our users? How do we get people to participate in a way that feels fulfilling? And then how do we govern our projects effectively? And all these different pieces are important, but I think the important thing is knowing the order in which these things tend to happen. Because most of us actually operate in fairly linear ways. The way you go to a restaurant, if you go to Olive Garden, you go to a really fancy restaurant, it's the same basic order. You get there, you get a table, you get menus, you get water, you pick your food, you pay your bill, and off you go. What defines the experience is the quality of the food and the environment and the seating and the ambience, all those different pieces. So first thing I think is figure out that workflow and then look at the pieces that you glue into it, like Slack for communication or ZenHub for planning. And one thing I'd highly advise against is picking one thing that does everything, because you can't find one thing that does everything well. This was the mistake that SourceForge made. The benefit here is today we live in a world where you can glue these different pieces together. And then I think what we want to do is look at how we build that interface to get people using that workflow effectively. So for example, for new people, I think you want to build something that I've been calling the new Developer Onramp for a while. And there's basically 6 pieces to it that I'm going to walk through. So imagine someone's brand new to edX rather. They're here, and up there at the top right-hand corner, they've done something, they're feeling really good about what they've done. Okay? This provides 6 pieces that you should put in place in every community, in every company to do this well. The first piece is discovering it, making it easy for people to discover that you can actually participate. This is going to be your blogging, your social media, your YouTube videos, having a website that makes it very clear that the community is at the heart of what we do and how we produce great things. The second piece is make it really easy to get your tool chain set up. I see this problem all the time in GitHub projects where you have a README file that says, hey, this is this project, but it doesn't tell you how to actually build the code. You should be able to make it one-click easy for people to get your tool chain set up. And also, much as I'm using a Mac now, not just for Macs, but for Windows and for Linux as well. The next piece is, so someone's discovered it, they're excited, they get their tool chain set up. Now what they need to do is learn the skills to participate. So this is going to be things such as, in programming terms, it's going to be coding conventions and coding styles and how the code is laid out and how it works and how the project operates and how code review works. You should provide knowledge and documentation about how all of these different pieces work. And importantly, this is not just about writing lots of words on a web page. Twitter has taught us that people don't like to consume large pieces of information anymore, that we have to condense that down as small as possible. Then once you've learned that knowledge, the next thing to do is to figure out something to work on. And this in itself is complicated. We want to make sure, for example, that new developers can pick something that's small but fulfilling, okay? One of the things I recommend for projects is that you tag easy bugs with a bite-sized label. And then, because then you can have a big list of bugs that are suitable for new developers. Don't give a developer a giant, uncertain task for them to work on. Otherwise, they'll never succeed. You want them to get something up and running and be successful within an hour. The next piece, I think, is going to be finding help. And this is critically important, is having a support resource that people can look at that's not only filled with people who can actually help, but has a tonality of no question is stupid. Remember, that's one of our fears for our user persona, is looking stupid. So the way in which we construct all of these things is look at that user persona to guide the policies and the technology and how these pieces glue together. And then finally, and I think possibly most important, is that when that person has discovered your on-ramp, they've set the tools up, they've learned what to do, they found a task, they've done it, they've asked for help, and they've done the whole thing out in the open, naked in front of the community. That's a huge accomplishment. Even if they fixed a tiny little string fix, that's a huge accomplishment. We need to make those people feel really good about themselves. And this is thanking them personally. This is not having a computer send them a thank you email. No one likes that. This is making them feel good, because that recognition will fuel them for the next task that they do. And then before you know it, you're building momentum. Now, that's the new role. For the regular people, the people who are regularly participating in the projects, it's different, because they do this cycle. And typically, you want these people to understand the context of what's happening, understand the standards of engagement, such as coding conventions and how things operate. You want them to be able to chat with each other and discuss with each other around ideas, to be able to write code, submit pull requests, engage in continuous integration and testing, engage in effective code review, and then feel some kind of intrinsic or extrinsic reward for that. And what's important, and where this is different, is with a new developer on-ramp for new developers, it's about making sure that each step neatly connects to the next step. With this, it's about making sure that this is covered in WD-40, that it's completely frictionless. Because when one of these bits becomes annoying and sticks out, people won't want to do it. It's kind of like, if you work in a company where you're building great code, for example, but the way in which you submit your timesheets or expenses is really irritating, you don't end up submitting timesheets and expenses and you get into trouble or you have no money left. So we want to look at that workflow and make sure that's efficient. And for our core developers, I think it's basically a similar workflow, but you want them to make sure that they have influence in the areas that they really care about. And that's going to be things like writing code, pull requests, CI, and reviews. Like, developers typically care about the effectiveness of writing code. And you want to make sure that as people build their reputations in the community, that they can influence the workflow that they're participating in. And that's a really fundamental but core element here. So I'd say the other thing here is, when looking at all of this, what's really important is that we track the workflow of how we're doing this. I remember going to a conference, and I was sat at the airport having a beer, and I got sat next to this guy, and he just said to me one time, if you're not counting, it doesn't matter. And I think that's a really important point, is that we should count everything. The problem with modern software development is that we end up with a dashboard that looks like this. And everybody rambles on about Google Analytics and all these different numbers and statistics that you can count. And everybody talks about numbers. But in reality, just having more numbers doesn't matter. What matters in my mind is you count the numbers, but you focus on the trends and the patterns. Okay? And it's about gluing these numbers together in interesting ways. So for example, if you want to look at the effectiveness of code review, you would look at how many pull requests are coming in, how quickly the first comment appears in that pull request, how quickly the overall pull request takes to get reviewed and merged, how many rounds of reviews and changes there needs to be, how many developers are participating in that code review process. When you glue those different pieces of information together in different ways, it gives you an outcome. It gives you a trend that you can actually work with. So I'm going to zip through the rest of this because I'm conscious of time, but the final piece here is participation. How do we actually, so we've understood people, we've mapped out the optimal workflow based upon those principles of human beings. Now, how do we actually get people in? How do we get them onto that new Developer Onramp particularly? I have a rule that I've developed, which I call the 1066 rule, which has got nothing to do with the medieval times. You don't go around, using the Iron Maiden on people. The point here is that of your community, about 10% of them are going to be highly engaged, okay? That's generally the maths that people tend to look at. And there is a principle in psychology that if you want anybody to change their habits, it takes 66 days to develop a habit. So everybody in this room, everyone will want to develop a new habit. Some of you will want to eat less fast food. Some of you will want to work out more, things like that. It takes 66 days from you starting to do that religiously to get to the point where it just becomes autopilot. So the goal that we should have here is at any one time, 10% of our audience is always working towards 66 days of service in the community. If we do that, we end up building our community significantly. And one of the things I recommend is you look at that first 66 days and you map that out into what happens at which different points. Now, there is another rule here as well, which I call the 1% rule, which has got nothing to do with Wall Street bankers. And the basic principle here is that of that overall community, 1% of them will be your freaking rock stars. These will be the people who show up every day, who care about every intimate detail, who are like the people you call in the evenings to get advice from. Really take care of those people. They will all start out in the 10% initially. Well, they'll start out in the 100%, then they'll go to the 10%, and then it will become the 1%. In the same way that we build relationships in anything, take care of these people. These are the people you fly to conferences. These are the people you send emails to. These are the people you phone. These are the people you send thank you cards. These are the people you send a card to when they have children. Like, you really take care of them. These are the lifelong friendships that you build. And I think what's interesting is that we can look at how we build effective participation by inspiring ourselves from salespeople. How many of you are in this room work in sales? Okay, a couple of people. The same level of sheepishness from earlier on, by the way. Salespeople get a hard... You what? They eat at McDonald's. Salespeople get a hard time because some people think that salespeople just go out there and blindly con people into giving them money. And that's only partially true. But salespeople have this notion of like you have prospects who are just the world, you convert them into leads, and then you qualify those leads, and then they become opportunities. And opportunities are the things that you can actually do, and then they become clients. And what's interesting is that these 4 areas are potential, viability, relationships, and then actual engagement. And I think we can take some of those similar principles and apply that to how we build communities. Because you've got potential, but that's capturing someone's interest. The viability is getting them to be curious about your project and your community. And then we actually twist these 2 around, and we have submission is the engagement, and participation is how we build those relationships. And twisting that around is the important piece, is that what we're doing here is we're getting people excited, we get them to do something first of all, and then we use that as a starting point for building those really strong relationships, okay? So we've already talked about this, the submission piece, which is all that workflow that we talked about earlier on. But when we look at these two pieces, this is about attracting people in. And I think there's a few things we can look at here. Having a really simple but really focused website. You know, don't have a wiki with loads of text on it. It should look like a product website. Put together a blog, but also importantly, have a content plan. You know, everybody who builds a community sets up a blog. But don't just do that. Say for the next 6 months, we want 3 posts a week. These are the topics we're going to write about. These are the people who are going to write them. These are the deadlines when they have to be done. That regular content schedule will get your community up and running. Do the same thing for social media, but importantly, don't cover every boneheaded social media network out there. Cover the important ones. I found that Twitter and Facebook are the most important too. But you know, look at what's popular at any one time and make it culturally relevant. In China, it's not going to be Twitter and Facebook, for example. Build a knowledge base which has got that documentation and help that people can have so you can reduce the level of hand-holding for people getting up the on-ramp. And then build partner relationships. Build relationships with other organizations and groups so you can start growing your community out further. And then the other piece is how we build those relationships. And I think the way in which we do that is we really focus on building someone's reputation in a community. Communities are fundamentally meritocracies. And people talk a lot of smack about meritocracies because they're not really very accurate. But the basic principle is that you build your reputation based upon great work. And that's what we want to do here. And we build relationships with those people who do that. This is also about great leadership, and we lead by example. There's a lot of controversy in some communities about conduct and how people operate as leaders. I don't care what those people say. It matters. If you're a leader, you have to lead by example. And if you don't lead by example, the culture will reflect the worst traits of leaders. That passes on to conduct and making sure that we create an inclusive environment for everybody, and that we help people to evolve, like through those status types and through those levels of relatedness. And then finally, an interesting thing to explore as well is gamification. But gamification, importantly, is usually only useful when they get for the first 15 to 20 badges. At about 20 badges, people stop caring about the badges. So gamification is a useful tool for new people coming in, but most regular people and core people generally don't care about it as much, with some relative exceptions. So bringing this into a conclusion, the most important thing I'd say is be an eternal student. You know, I feel very fortunate because people say I wrote the book in community. I don't know what I'm talking about. I've learned some things over the years, and the amount that I've learned since I wrote that book is phenomenal, you know, and this happens with everything and everyone who does this. So we're eternal students. No one knows everything, and the only way in which we grow is to actually look at the people who this affects, not at other community managers and other community builders. So in summary, I'm going to walk through this real quick. Create new regular and core roles. Set your expectations clearly. Build your user personas for those roles. Identify those behavioral patterns and opposites. Identify the workflow and deploy your infrastructure. Create those on-ramps for the new roles and that frictionless workflow for regular and core roles. Measure trends and patterns, not just the numbers. Focus on that 10%, getting them up and running, but then really look after your 1% and get them working for 66 days to build habits. Build your interest and curiosity, implement great participation architecture, and then finally assume the role of an eternal student. And I think we don't have time for Q&A, so thank you, everyone.